Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And James, who are we talking to today?
Well, we're talking to two people, and Tessa won't mind me saying this, but one of them is very, very special indeed, and it's not Tessa. It's Grace Taylor, who used to work in the war on an anti-aircraft gun team. Tessa has been brilliant in bringing her to We Have Ways, and Grace and Tessa, you are both incredibly welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, lovely to meet you, Grace. Now, Tessa, how did you discover Grace? Because you're like a, I was nearly called you a truffle hog. Then you're like your ability to, that came out wrong. Your ability to find people who have these incredible stories to tell is unrivaled. So how have you come by Grace?
Well, Grace and I feel like we go back a long way, Grace, but it's actually only been 18 months.
That's right. Yeah. Because the WRAC wanted to find the oldest still alive ATS girl, because there aren't many of us left now. And because I still go to the Royal Artillery Association meetings, a committee put my name forward because I'm the only ex-ATS girl that goes to these meetings, you see. And so it was the WRAC that started this going in the beginning, wasn't it, Tessa?
Well, I think that's how they found you. And then I wanted to write a book to acknowledge the anniversary of conscription for women, although Grace will probably jump in here and say, but Tessa, I volunteered before conscription for women was introduced. And so, and I wasn't interested in finding the oldest women, to be honest, because I thought they might not stay the course, because I was doing this project during lockdown. And I did, in fact, lose 4. But Grace is strong as an ox. And just this morning said to me, Tessa, 97 you are, Grace. We're allowed to mention your age because it's something to show off about. And Grace, give them your health tip. You just gave me the most cracking health tip. I'm getting it all wrong, guys.
Well, we can't have you not being well and the work you're doing, can we?
But what did you tell me? How do you stay alive every day? What's your tip?
I have fresh orange juice, pure orange juice every day. I've done it for years. And you've got to keep your vitamin C up.
Right, okay.
Well, I've got to say, Grace, what I'd like to do, if this is all right with you, is go back to sort of pretty much the beginning and ask you about where you were born and brought up and what your father did and whether you had any siblings and so on.
Well, in the very beginning, of course, we were a very happy little family, and there were 3 girls. My older sister was 2 years older than me, but my younger sister was 9 years younger than me. So Mum had us 3 girls. Dad was a very hard-working man. We were a very happy family. Unfortunately, Mum died when I was 11.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but and it was awful the way it happened, because she'd only been in hospital a week and I didn't even know she was ill. And on this particular night, Dad had been seeing her after work. He would go and see her in the hospital, you see, and he would take us to an auntie while he was visiting her. On this particular night, we were walking along. My elder sister and I were, he was holding our hand and we were walking along, and I said to him, "Who's with Mum now then, Dad?" And he said, "Nobody, she died."
Oh, Grace.
I can understand that he needed to get married again, because there was no way that he could look after 3 girls and do a full-time job.
And what was his job?
He worked for a gaslight and coke company, because we lived at Ilford, you see.
Oh.
He was in the First World War himself. He was a soldier. And that was the only job he ever did. And unfortunately, as I say, he really needed someone to look after us. So he remarried. Where he found this lady, I do not know. But she wasn't a bit like my mum. My mum loved us. But she wanted my father, but she didn't want us girls. Well, my sister was 13, you see, and she came up to 14, and they put her into domestic service. Well, I was 12 at the time he'd got married, so I had a couple of years to stay with my stepmother. But before I was 14, she put me into domestic service as well.
Goodness. So where were you working?
I hadn't even had my 14th birthday. So she was just left with my little sister, who by then, of course, was, nearly 4.
Wow. And so where did you go and work, Grace?
I was sent down to Southend, well, Westcliff, actually, which is next to Southend. Because this woman that he married was a farmer's daughter, and he bought the bungalow, and she didn't want Mum's furniture, so he had to store that and replaced all the furniture for her. He did all he could for her, but the fact still remained that he'd only got my young sister with him. And of course, when one of my aunties went to visit him on one occasion, and she saw how they were treating young Anne, and she said, "I'm not leaving her here with you." She said to my father, "I'm taking her back with me." So he lost all 3 girls.
Goodness me.
As far as I was concerned, I didn't like being in service. I'd never done housework before. and there was a small child there, and I was supposed to feed her and look after her. I'd never looked after a child before. I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to do something. I then found a job in Rayleigh, Essex, gradually working my way back towards London, you see. When I was there, I got a job in service again, but it was a different situation, and I had the evenings off and I could go dancing. I love ballroom dancing.
Yeah.
When I was with Mum and Dad, of course, Dad liked dancing, and he used to dance with my sister and I, ballroom dancing, but even when we were young girls, you know.
Did you still have any contact with your father?
No.
Oh, goodness Grace, that's so tough.
Yeah, because in actual fact, my stepmother walked out on him. He hadn't got us girls and he hadn't got a wife. She walked out on him and went back to her farm life with her mother and father were the farmers, you see.
Wow. And did you have any more contact with your sisters?
Oh, yes. I was very, very close with my older sister. But, of course, my younger sister was being brought up with different aunts and uncles all her life, really.
It must have taught you the most incredible resilience. I mean, it's a sort of sink or swim kind of situation, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I knew I'd got to stand on my own 2 feet, you see, so it makes you strong.
I don't think I've met any woman who liked being a domestic servant. 1 in 4 girls between the wars were in domestic service. And it was such a lonely job for you, Grace, wasn't it? You were lonely.
You're the only staff, you see. There's no you can't have any friends as such. But I was lucky in this sense that being in Brentwood, and I knew they had a dance hall there, and I started going when I did have evenings off after I'd served dinner and cleared up. I could then get changed and go and have a dance for a couple of hours.
And what about the people you were working for? I mean, were they decent to you?
Oh, they were very nice people. Yes, they were. They were business people. He was a dress designer, in actual fact, in London, and his 2 daughters were, well, I suppose, in their 20s, and they were actresses. You know, they were in films. They were very pretty girls, but they looked after me. They used to give me their dresses that they didn't wear anymore, so I had some nice dresses.
Grace, tell them about your first hug, and tell them about what happens, because you meet someone very significant dancing in these cast-off dresses, don't you?
Yes, I did, you see, because, I mean, my wages were £2 a month. It was like 10 bob a week. But, of course, they fed me, and I had a nice little room of my own. But anyway, these evenings when I went dancing, I palled up with this young soldier, and he was stationed at Worley Barracks just outside Brentwood.
The war had begun at this point.
Oh yes, it had. Oh yes, he was in the army. He was in the Ordnance Corps. He was a blacksmith, actually. Yes, but we'd been going dancing. He was my only boyfriend. You see, my first and only boyfriend, and. It was quite pleasant those few months, but then they told him they were posting him away. So he came to where I worked one morning and told me that he was going away. I was quite upset, actually. And although we kept in touch, and I got the stupid idea that if I joined up, I might meet him. If I joined up in the army, I might meet him. Stupid now, I know, but at the time, I thought I'd do anything to see my Eddie again. Anyway, I did join up, and I was selected to go into the Royal Artillery.
Wow, just like that.
Just like that, yeah. Well, when I joined up, I didn't tell anybody I was going to join up, but I had to go back to Southend to do it. So I waited for my half day off, caught a bus from Brentwood to Southend, and went and signed on. I had my medical and everything was okay. But then they said, we'll let you know, when we've got enough girls to all go together.
Grace, what were you expecting to do? Did being in the artillery take you by surprise? Or?
I had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, they do their selection tests, you see. So I mean, I didn't know anything about the army. It's just that I thought, well, that would be nice. I like the idea of wearing a uniform. And I didn't.
And Grace, her timing was really good. This was 1941. And two things are interesting about Grace's story. She signed up before the mandatory age of 17 and a half, because you could lie about your age, couldn't you, Grace? Because you had no parents getting in your way.
So many did put their age on. Lots of girls did. But you see, they never asked for a birth certificate. Nobody ever checked it. And I just didn't mention it again to anybody. But you see, you go in as a girl and you come out as a woman.
And the other thing that's interesting about Grace's story is in 1941, in the April, so conscription's December, but in the April, they tear up the rule book because they're desperate and they allow women onto operational sites. And this mass selection process starts because they don't want any old girl. They want girls who can operate really high tech equipment on the gun sites, because one of the big complaints by General Pyle has been, the boys that he gets are basically the duds. The Royal Artillery, all the good guys want to go off abroad, want to go to the front line, they're selected. And he sort of complains, when they double up to the gun, their glass eye falls out. And he goes to the War Office and says, girls are going to be able to do this better. And he's done the homework before the war. He saw this would happen. He got this female engineer to prove, in inverted commas, that girls could do the job. And you can see Grace as a gift. I mean, God, she is a gift for any historian to write about. But we had a few arguments, didn't we, Grace, or differences of opinion? Because one of the things was you girls were never allowed to operate or go anywhere near the guns, were you?
Well, no, certainly not when there were raids on, when we were actually, on duty doing our serious work. But I mean, of course, we did know we'd been into the gun pits and when we were off duty, not necessarily off duty, but just practicing, we were allowed to walk along and see what happened. And
can you explain to Alan and James what you actually did, what the gun site looked like and where your part was?
Yes. In the centre was the instruments that the girls were working, and that was a predictor, a height finder, and a spotter. And you had a sort of a low wall built around you, so you had a certain amount of, protection. Yeah. And around the command post were what they called 3.7 very large guns. The men, of course, worked the guns because they could carry the ammunition. They were very big shells. Yeah. And of course, their job was to look after the guns and keep them clean and line them up and replace the ammunition that they'd used. They had to do that through the day when we weren't busy. And of course, the girls were working on the instruments to work out. You've got to first of all find the plane, and you've got to recognise the plane to know it's yours or not yours. And then of course you've got to set your instruments on them and follow them, and my job was to find the bearing and the angle and the height of the actual plane, and the predictor did much the same thing, and you have to do lots of practice as well before you actually go on doing your serious firing. But you see, the men needed the girls to tell them where to fire. and the girls needed the men to do the firing. So, we needed each other. They were mixed heavy ACAC batteries, you see.
Grace, I'm sorry to interrupt just then. I suppose I'm just thinking about the fact that you left school before you should have done. You were sent off into service. You learned some resilience, but suddenly you're actually doing something which is of great value to your country, but also which involves using your brain and learning a skill. I mean, presumably that must have been, again, that's the sort of thing you either kind of completely relish and take on board and find rewarding, or you would kind of sort of slightly or struggle with it. And presumably you relished it, did you?
I was still educated. I was quite educated, and I did very well at school. And as I say, I wasn't silly, and I could pick things up. I could pick things up because I was in service. It was only 3 or 4 years, wasn't it? Yeah. And that I knew what they were talking about, and when you're going through all your training, of course you listen and you take it all in and you remember it all, and I was good at my job. And when you're good at your job, you do it better, don't you?
And in a way, this was where people talk about the People's War, and there's all this kind of romantic, nostalgic notion of what the war did. But it really did change Grace's life. It bumped her out of not just a pedestrian girls' world, but a demeaning pedestrian girls' world. And she came in just at the right time in 41 when they were selecting, rigorously working out the best girls for the job. 30,000 girls were orderlies, were domestic servants within the ATS, not our Grace. She was absolutely cutting edge. She was doing the job Mary Churchill did. In my book, Lady Martha Bruce, that she was immediately selected. This was the sort of place where the top end girls went, and Grace.
Well, that was my point, really. I suppose what I was trying to make out was that clearly Grace is a very bright person, and I can see that if you've been sort of held back in life through circumstances, to suddenly have the opportunity to take responsibility, use your obviously very able brain, that's something that that Grace clearly jumped at, and good on her for doing so.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. We had some very frightening times, but at the same time, I had friends then, you see. That's what I needed. I needed comrades.
Yes.
And having such a lonely life after I lost Mum, then, I sort of grabbed every opportunity I could to make friends. And I was with a lovely group of girls, and I stayed with the same girls all through, right until, the ACAC was disbanded.
Until Kathy Bott got pregnant, Grace. You couldn't get pregnant.
Well, two of my close friends was Lil Crow, Kathy Bott and myself, the Three Stooges. And unfortunately, Kath got pregnant. I don't know how or why, because we were nearly always together, but she must have had a chance to break away. Because she had to be sent home, you see, and they just left Lil and me. But
there was very, very strict rules. Paragraph 11. You could not get illegitimately pregnant. You immediately disbanded off any gun site, weren't you, Grace?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that until Kath got pregnant, you see. We never even thought about getting pregnant or even going with fellas. No, you just...
And were you still in touch with Eddie? It was Eddie, wasn't it?
Yes, Eddie. We wrote to each other pretty often, well, practically every week. They sent him out into the Middle East to Port Said. And
gosh,
yes. So as I say, the last letter I had from him, he said, "I haven't heard for so long, so I assume you must have found yourself another boyfriend." Well, I hadn't, of course, but it was just that our letters were held up. And he said, if ever I meet him, I'll tell him what a lucky guy he is. But of course, I from then on, of course, I didn't write again. I thought, well, if he thinks I've got somebody else and I haven't, so.
But But you did find someone, didn't you, Grace? But it's really just before we fall into her amazing love story, because there is quite a special moment in that love story. Hopefully you'll be prepared to share it, Grace. There was absolute fear. You've got no idea how panicked the War Office were about asking women to serve alongside men. And it wasn't just the War Office. The generation above Grace, the parents, they were just so anxious about the idea of women being in these dehumanizing uniforms, working alongside men. And there was a parliamentary committee established to get rid of derogatory rumours derogatory to the service. And they actually this parliamentary committee counted and proved there were more illegitimate pregnancies outside the military services for women than inside them. That was the fear around this idea of, girls getting the wrong idea in uniform. But Grace, you absolutely, what's the expression you used? You kept your knees together, didn't you, Grace?
Yes.
That's what she told me. But you meet your Bob. Tell them how you meet your Bob.
I was a virgin when I got married. Yeah. Yes. But you see, we had a driver, who wasn't in the artillery, but he was attached to us to do the driving. We had 2 or 3 drivers. But this particular one, our eyes met and we fell in love. To cut a long story short, and our only courtship really was in the NAFI, in the evening when we were off duty. But then we decided we thought it would be a good idea to get married, and he got his sister to do all the arranging. And in 1944, we came back to London on 4 days' leave, and we got married. It was all arranged for us.
Wait a minute, tell them about the nightie.
Well, on one of the raids, I was stationed on a gun site between Cheltenham and Gloucester. And that was the only time, really, that I wasn't on the coast. But anyway, we were firing this night, and this plane, we got it, and the plane came down, and the pilot bailed out with his parachute. And we watched the parachute coming down, and it was just a few fields away. It was out in the country, of course. And we saw him come down. And when we were stood down from that particular raid, the girls that were on duty, there was only about 10 of us, we were told that if we liked to go and find this parachute, we could share it. Well, of course, we did find it eventually, and we did share it. All the girls didn't want a piece, but I thought that'd be rather nice because I'd never seen white nylon before. And so I had this piece, and my older sister, she was not allowed to be called up, so she was still working in London. She made a nightdress for me out of it, and she really did it.
Amazing.
It was a lovely nightdress, and of course that was kept for my first night. Well, it wasn't used, but at least I had it. And that was the story of the parachute.
Amazing.
We need to take a short break right now. We'll be back in a second with Grace. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're talking to Tessa Dunlop and Grace from the ATS.
Grace, you mentioned there were a few frightening moments. Are you able to? Are you willing to talk about those?
Well, I was stationed on Crown Hill on a gun site, just overlooking Plymouth, and I was there when Plymouth was flattened.
Wow!
And we could see it all going on. Of course, we were firing all night. We were on duty all night, of course, and it was cold and miserable. But anyway, it was dreadful. The noise was awful, not just with the guns, but of course with the planes and with the searchlights. And it was a terrible noise. Anyway, when it was all over, the girls that had been on duty, we came off duty in the morning, and they said if we wanted to go into town, we could. So my little group of girls, we could walk to the town from where the site was. And we went down to town, and the people that had shops were trying to collect what they could rescue from their stock, you see. in the rubble. And this particular chappie had a table out, like a paste table he'd put up, and he was trying to collect his cosmetics. And I assume it was a chemist, I don't know. And we were looking on this table at some of the stuff that he'd rescued, and he had California Poppy, and that was my favourite perfume. And I hadn't had it for a long time, and oh my goodness, I've got to buy some of that. And it was 6p a bottle. So I bought a couple of bottles of this Californian Poppy, and he also had Evening in Paris. That was in little blue bottles. So it helped me forget the dreadful night before, because I was so pleased about getting me perfume.
What's interesting about Grace's story is there was this real concern that by putting women in uniform, quote unquote, this is the parliamentary committee, you'd be hardening Britain's future wives and mothers. Somehow they'd lose their femininity. And there was this great emphasis on girls having to retain their femininity while at the same time being turned into soldiers and doing the drill and the PT, the dreaded PT, Grace? And Grace is a wonderful combination of that, really hardy, up all night, firing away, but absolutely feminine to her core. You were like the perfect ATS girl. And you were also the exemplar of like someone who'd come from domestic service and proved that actually class was no boundary, that you could go where you needed to. I always think you're like the model soldier, Grace, to be honest.
Well, I like to think so. I mean, I do like to think so, because I always looked after my uniform, and I was as smart as any girl could be. I went on a physical training course. I was the only PTI physical training instructors on the gun site. And
amazing.
Well, I like that, because I was pretty fit, and I still am, really, for my age.
You certainly are. How did you take to battle dress?
Well, we had to wear a battle dress with boots and gaiters, of course. We had nice brown leather boots with our gaiters and our battle dress. Yeah, I liked it. We had to wear that practically all the time. The only time we ever put our dress suit on was when we were on parade, but that wasn't very often.
It's also really interesting, just quickly, how the optics of war have changed. In the ATS, 770 women die. A couple of other women in the book, the Army Girls, Daphne, for instance, her friend Dorothy died on a gun site, was hit by shrapnel, because what goes up must come down. Often girls and boys died from what they'd fired up into the sky, not from enemy raiders, not from the Luftwaffe themselves. So 770, nothing compared to the numbers of men, obviously 250,000 or whatever, who died, British men. But if you look at today's optics, in Afghanistan, a 10-year conflict, less than 500 British personnel die in that 10-year conflict. Now, we don't even think really of women losing their lives in the Second World War, except in the sort of total war, the Blitz, etc. And yet more girls die just in one service than doing that entire British personnel in that entire 10-year conflict. It's just really interesting, isn't it? The way in which our optics about the amount of loss we're prepared to conceive or take has changed in the last 80 years.
Grace, did you consider it dangerous, or was danger part of the routine of being in the anti-aircraft service, or did you put that out of your mind?
Well, we tried not to show that we were frightened, of course, but I mean, there's always a chance. But I do know of a gun site which was exactly the same as the one I was on, down on the south coast, and they were firing on this particular night with the Nazis coming over, and one of the planes dived, and I don't quite know what he used, whether it was machine guns or what it was on the plane, but he fired at the gun site, and there were 12 killed on that particular night, girls and boys. And I think to myself, well, wasn't I lucky that never happened to us? But you see, there were 300,000 ATS girls during the war. I don't think people realised how many there were. We weren't all they weren't all in the Royal Artillery, of course, but it's a lot of girls, isn't it?
Yeah. It was the biggest military service, wasn't it? And I said earlier that we occasionally, what I find really interesting about Grace is something like only the boys could fire the guns. And Grace always says, oh yeah, that's because the shells were really heavy and we couldn't have lifted them. But in other areas, more ATS girls were drafted in to replace men if it was seen as physical work. But it was really important to the War Office that women retained that non-combatant status. It was absolutely vital. And Grace, you're absolutely a product of her generation where you believed that was the right thing. But in the same time, you're a time traveler, because now you think, oh, well, girls can do what they like and good for them, don't you? You got kind of a bipolar vision there.
Well, there's not much that the girls can't do, really. You know, I mean, they can keep up with the men any time now, can't they? I mean...
And you've outlived most of them.
Women can do most jobs now, can't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
Where were you when victory was declared in Europe?
It was late 44, I think it was. It may have been the beginning of 45, I'm not sure. But the gun sites were got rid of. They didn't need the heavy guns anymore, because most of the fighting was done in the sky, wasn't it? So I was sent to Glasgow with my friend. We were working on tanks then. They were bringing the tanks back from abroad to be painted and cleaned and serviced and that. And then I think they was being sent out again.
At that point, they conscript women again to go abroad. There aren't enough volunteers and parents won't give their permission. But they exempt married women, because obviously you need girls to back up your 2 million strong Allied army going into Europe. And initially they think they'll get enough volunteers. And Mary Churchill's, off she's sent as a sort of exemplar of, poster girl for going into Europe. But only 1 in 30 girls get the permission. But I think, Grace, you probably didn't go because you were married to Bob, weren't you? And married women were exempt.
Yes, we got married in 44, you see, but there were no married quarters on gun sites, of course. You couldn't do that. So we knew that when we went back to camp that he was going to be posted away. And, of course, at the end of the war, they sent him to Germany. But he was only there a couple of years. So, then, of course, I was demobbed myself. And
you were demobbed early because you were married, I think, weren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
So, but I'll tell you something now that I've never had a chance to tell you, Tessa. When we were sent up to Scotland, they didn't recognise girls in pubs. Girls weren't allowed to go into pubs. It was only men. And so when we did get any time off in the evenings, there was nowhere for us to go, nothing for us to do. Well, the transport picked us up. We were at St Johnstone outside Glasgow, took us into Glasgow. And my friend and I went to the railway station and we bought a penny platform ticket each. You could buy these penny platform tickets so that you could wave people goodbye, you see. Well, we didn't. We got on the train and we came back to London because they didn't recognise Christmas in Scotland.
You're so right. I grew up in Scotland.
Yeah.
That's really made me laugh because my mum married a Scot and she couldn't get over the fact that there was no women in the pubs when she arrives up in the 1970s.
So anyway, we came down to London on this train through the night, and it seemed a long, long journey, of course. And it was packed full of troops, people going on soldiers and that going on leave. And it was a carriage with a corridor, and at the end of this corridor there was sort of luggage racks. So my friend curled up on one and I curled up on the other. We had our greatcoats with us. We were in our dress uniforms, and we covered ourselves with our coats and we curled up. Well, I can always remember an old man came round swinging a lamp. He was checking on parties or something, I think. But he didn't disturb us because he thought we were asleep. When we got to London, there was a raid on. And, of course, everybody gets out the train and runs. So, of course, we ran with them. So we got out the station okay. And she went to her family and I went to my sister's. And we stayed away for a fortnight. And, of course, we were in touch with each other. And I went to see her and I said, I think we ought to start thinking about going back. So we went to the RTO on the station and he gave us passes to get back to Scotland. And And of course, when we got there, we reported that we'd been absent without leave. And they gave us both, they put us on a charge, of course, and gave us 7 days confined to barracks. But
You naughty girl, Grace. You never told me that. But I love the fact that you notice Scots don't celebrate Christmas, because it's a really English tradition. The Presbyterians in Scotland are such Scrooges about Christmas, even till now.
that's right. Oh, is it the same now? Yeah, I know.
No, come on, it's changed in the last
Yes, with respect
30,
to our
40 years.
Scottish listeners, yeah.
But it's true, they'll agree with you. That's why Hogmanay is a much bigger. The
Yeah,
New
yeah.
Year's Eve celebration is way bigger. It used to be. It's changed a lot in the last 30 odd years.
Well, we wanted to celebrate Christmas. We didn't care about the New Year. So we came home to celebrate Christmas. But anyway, they gave us a 7 day CB, and it didn't make any difference because, I mean, we could only go into Glasgow anyway. There was nothing for us to do. So it wasn't really a punishment for us. I think they really sat with their tongue in their cheek, you know. And shortly after that, of course, we were demobbed. But it was an experience. That's all I can... I've never been to Scotland since.
And the other thing about Grace's story is, unlike a lot of the women I found and wrote about, it was almost a bit flat. They kind of had this amazing experience because it did change women's lives, that generation. And then they kind of just do what the Beveridge report says, breed for Britain. They go back, get married, have babies. And the last, often it was the only job they had. Their reference from the war was the only reference they had. Whereas Grace, you used it. It changed your life. You had this extraordinary career, didn't you? Tell them briefly what you did. You went, first of all, in the GPO, a big job, and then set yourself up.
Well, when I came out, you see, I knew I'd got to earn money, of course, to get a home together. I was a new, bride, and my sister said to me, well, she was in the GPO as a telephonist, and she said, well, why don't you come and, why don't you join? Well, I did, and I passed my tests, and it's quite a strict training. There's quite a lot to do. And I was used to it.
And then you own all those pubs and stuff. You're a publican, aren't you? You have restaurants and pubs.
Well, I was a GPO telephonist. They took me on, and I was that for 20 years. And at the end of 20 years, my husband said, I knew he always wanted to go into the licensed trade because his parents had a pub. And I said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. We've been saving, and you need quite a bit of money when you go into the trade. So we did. We had a public house in Somerset, and then we've been there about 6-7 years, and we had a hotel also in Somerset, and we had 3 bars there and a skittle alley, and
not bad for someone who begins as a servant girl aged 14, is it?
Incredible.
yes,
Incredible, Grace.
yeah.
I've got to say, when I first met Grace, she made me, that story she told me made me cry so much. You're a cracking woman, Grace. You're a good friend, and I love Grace. Just in case you think you can feel free to fall in love with Grace, because there's something about you, a very big-hearted, amazing woman. Amazing
Well, you've
woman.
had an amazing life, that's for sure.
Yes, you
Yeah.
certainly
Yeah.
have, Grace. Extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I get nights where I don't sleep, and I go through the whole lot, and I think, oh my God, didn't you do a lot in your life? I look back on it now. I don't think it at the time. I've always been a hard worker, and of course I've been able to cook. I used to do all the cooking in the pub and the hotel, and very busy.
Tough. And
Amazing.
domestic service was a bit like boarding school. The two polar ends of the class system, those who'd been to boarding school and those in domestic service, seemed to do best in the military services. They'd been away from home, they'd been in a uniform, they'd been treated pretty roughly sometimes. And Grace is a cracking example of surviving in the face of adversity, aren't you, Grace?
Yes, because you see, really, that going into service, that was really only a stepping stone. As I say, I went in as a girl and came out as a woman. Yeah. I've had a lovely life. I mean, the man I married, he was wonderful, and he spoilt me rotten. He worshipped the ground I walked on, and even a couple of days before, he was only in hospital a week when he suddenly died. And the last thing he said to me was, "When I get out of here," he said, "we're going to go back dancing again." But of course, he didn't come out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And do you know, that was 30 years ago. I lost my husband. Yeah, I was 67 then. And I'm 97
Grace,
now.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we love you, Grace. You're an absolute diamond.
Yes, it's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Really fantastic.
Yeah, it has. It's been wonderful, and what an insight, and what a remarkable person you are. So, thank you very much for sharing your memories. And
Well, do you know? I went to yesterday, Sunday. I went to the Royal Artillery Association because I still go to their meetings now. I'm their president, you see, of the Poole branch.
amazing.
And I went to their luncheon yesterday, what they call a St Barbara's lunch. She was our patron saint of the Royal Artillery. And, of course, when the speeches were given after the meal, it was mentioned about Tessa's book, of course. And because she's met some of the people, she's met our chairman and secretary and so forth on her visits. Because recently, Tessa and I did a show at the Lighthouse in Poole.
No, we've got out there, haven't we, Grace? But I think they need to go now. But thank you. Grace got the mention of the book in. Do you see? Well primed.
Yeah,
My
very strong.
Go.
Well, we'd love you to come back in July if you're game.
Really?
Come talk at our Warfest.
Yeah, and listen, Grace is mobile with Lorraine. She's got this cracking carer. And you'll get in a car, won't you, Grace? She sits well in the front and we scootle about. So maybe we'll get Grace up to do a live turn.
Well, that'll be next year
That'd be
then.
wonderful.
Just got to stay alive and drink that orange juice, Grace. Keep drinking the orange juice.
Every day, Tessa, don't miss it.
Every day.
Don't miss it.
And make
every
no
day.
mistake, boys, not cordial. It's got to be fresh orange juice. It costs £1 in Aldi,
No.
Okay, good.
A bottle will last you about 5 days.
That's it. That's the job. Okay, so off the cigarettes and onto the
thank
orange
you.
juice.
Keep it in the
Thank you
fridge.
so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheerio.
Lots of love.